Hello everyone, welcome back to this amazing platform of Infinity Learn by Sri Chaitanya. My name is Kiran Choudhary and I am your biology faculty at Infinity Learn. Students, this lecture is in continuation with the lecture, the last one that I took on this chapter, Transport in Plants. Remember what we did in the last class? In the last class, I gave you an overview of this chapter, that what exactly we are going to study or whose transport, the substances, the various substances that need to be transported inside a plant. I told you what are they, right? And in what direction they will move. Second to that, what I was explaining you are the types of transport, the short distance transport and the long distance transport. And then I started explaining you the means of transport, right students? When I talk about means of transport, there I gave you the names of three transports: simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion and active transport, right students? And at the same time, when I was teaching you means of transport, I told you all the three means of transport: simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion and active transport are used to transport substances over short distance. So this lecture is in continuation with the previous one. In the previous, I completed in detail till simple diffusion, right? I explained to you what simple diffusion is, what are the characteristics of simple diffusion, or what are the characteristics of the substances who need to be transported over short distances with the help of simple diffusion. And also then we understood what are the various factors that actually affects the rate of simple diffusion. In this class, I will talk in detail about facilitated diffusion and active transport. So I hope students, till now it should be clear to everyone what are we going to do in this class. Students, before starting the class, I would love to tell this, that do visit to infinitylearn.com website. Our website, infinitylearn.com. Do visit to this website and check out the amazing courses that we offer there, my kids, right? And you can use those courses or subscription at straight 40% off by applying the code Kiran40. So do consider applying this code Kiran40 while using those subscription at infinitylearn.com website. So do check out. Now let us start the lecture, students. Means of transport part 2. What are we going to do here? We are going to talk about facilitated diffusion FD and active transport AT. So here we are. Yes. So let me give you a brief recap of the means of transport, right? Because we are going to talk about facilitated diffusion and active transport here, right? Hello everyone. Hello Abhirami. Very warm welcome in this class. I would really appreciate if you would participate too. See, so on this image, I explained to you this image is a very simple yet effective image to explain all the different means of transport used by molecules to get transported, or used by cell to transport molecules, substances over short distances that can be within a cell or from one cell to another cell. So these are the various means of transport. Simple diffusion, I need to change the ink. Simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and the third one was active transport. These all are means of transport needed to transport substances for short distance transport of substances, right? So these are the three means of transport needed to transport substances over a short distance. And what are these short distance? This can be within a cell, across a plasma membrane, or from one cell to another cell, right? So within a cell, across a plasma membrane, or from one cell to another. Please remember this point. Now I would love to continue this class with this facilitated diffusion. So let us start the class properly now with facilitated diffusion. So this is a very simple image that will give you an idea about what facilitated diffusion means. So this is what facilitated diffusion means. First, I want everybody to have a look for at least few seconds on this image and try to imagine how this transport looks different from simple diffusion. The name is facilitated diffusion. It is also a type of diffusion only, but it is not simple. It is facilitated diffusion. Why it is facilitated diffusion? Because here the molecules, the movement or the transport of substances across plasma membrane will be facilitated. I repeat myself, in this type of diffusion, movement of substances will be facilitated by membrane proteins. Yes, and it is diffusion. Why? Because movement of substances will be along the concentration gradient from high concentration region to low concentration region. But the only difference that you can see over here is in comparison to the simple diffusion, that is involvement of this transport proteins or membrane proteins. So here membrane proteins or the proteins that are present in the plasma membrane will help or will facilitate the movement of such substances, right? Now let us try to understand what facilitated diffusion is in detail. So here it goes, students. What I am going to do is, first I will provide you the definition of facilitated diffusion, and then we will try to understand it, each and every word of the definition in detail. So let us start with definition part itself. What is facilitated diffusion? So see my lovely kids, in facilitated diffusion there is short distance. In facilitated diffusion there is a short distance transport. I really hope students, till now it should be clear to all of you what is a short distance transport. Several times I have repeated, but still if someone is still confused over it, please let me know in the chat section. Short distance transport of substances, right? These substances can be molecules, they can be dissolved ions, solutes, etc., right? So short distance transport of substances or those find difficulty, short distance transport of substances those find difficult to cross plasma membrane. Those find difficulty, right? That would be better. In crossing plasma membrane from a region of their higher concentration, to a region of lower concentration. So see my kids, this is the most simplest possible definition of facilitated diffusion, most simple. Now let me crack this for you, okay? So what happens in facilitated diffusion is, first thing, there will be a short distance transport. That means within a cell or from one cell to another cell, from one cell to another cell across plasma membrane, right? So there will be short distance transport. That means from one cell to another cell or crossing the plasma membrane. Now during this, the substances who finds it difficult to cross the plasma membrane, their movement is going to be facilitated or aided or helped by the proteins that are present in the plasma membrane. Not all the proteins, but the proteins that can help in transportation, that can help in transporting the substances across plasma membrane. But do not forget students, this transport will be along the concentration gradient. Why? Because these substances whose transport needs to be facilitated, they are moving from a region of their higher concentration to a region of their lower concentration. Right? This much it should be clear. So, in facilitated diffusion, first of all, it is for those substances who finds it difficult to cross the plasma membrane. Although there is concentration gradient already existing, but still they find it difficult to cross the plasma membrane. And in such a diffusion, who is going to facilitate the movement of the substances? It is the membrane proteins. It is the membrane proteins who will help or in facilitating or will help or will aid the transport of such substances. So, see yes students, if I talk about this is scene 1, this is scene 1 and this is scene 2, right. So, in scene 1 you can see there is a higher concentration of blue molecules towards the outside of the cell and there are lower concentration of blue molecules inside, hence these blue molecules are moving along the concentration gradient, that is from the higher region of concentration to a lower region of their concentration, but here the movement is aided with the help of membrane protein, and this is what facilitated diffusion. But students, there is something still remaining to understand over here is why these molecules find it difficult to move across the plasma membrane. This is one of the most fundamental questions that you should ask to yourself as well as to your teacher, right? So, here I am giving you the explanation that why these molecules find it difficult to cross the plasma membrane. This is very important and conceptual part. So, please listen it very carefully. So, see students, if we talk about the plasma membrane, the materials or molecules or substances need to cross the plasma membrane, right? So, these plasma membrane, if I talk about the core of the plasma membrane, you must have studied when you were studying about or your teacher was teaching about the cell, the unit of life. There a detailed description about the structure of plasma membrane is given. So, remember from those concepts, from those classes of your cell, the unit of life, the membrane, the plasma membrane, the core of the plasma membrane is made up of lipid bilayer. Yes, my kids. The core of the plasma membrane is made up of lipid bilayer, and this lipid bilayer, if I talk about the lipid, the nature, the biochemical nature of the lipid is hydrophobic, right. So, this membrane, where should I write? Can I write here? I guess so. So, if I talk about this plasma membrane, it is made up of, MO means made up of lipid bilayer. It is made up of lipid bilayer. And this lipid bilayer is non-polar, or you can say it is hydrophobic in nature. So, see my kids, plasma membrane is what? Core of the plasma membrane is made up of lipids, and lipids are non-polar molecules. They do not possess polarity, right? Forget about being charged, they do not possess polarity. And another thing is, since they are non-polar, hence we can call them hydrophobic in nature. And you know students from your chemistry knowledge that like dissolves like. So, if the core of the plasma membrane is hydrophobic and non-polar, that means the molecules or substances that are non-polar or hydrophobic in nature can easily cross the plasma membrane. Just one condition, they should not be very large, that could not even move through the spaces present between the lipid bilayer. That's something that you need to consider definitely. But if the molecule or the substances are hydrophobic and non-polar, they can easily diffuse through the plasma membrane from their higher concentration region to their lower concentration region. But now let us talk about the molecules that are polar. The most common one, water. Water is a polar molecule, and I am pretty sure everybody knows that from your chemistry knowledge, right. So, water is a polar molecule, it possesses polarity, it has partial negative charges over the oxygen atom and partial positive over the hydrogen atoms, right. So, that means there is a polarity, positive and negative charges are towards separate poles, right, and because of which this polarity makes water molecules hydrophilic in nature, right? Hydrophilic in nature means having nature that type of water. So, with respect to water only hydrophobic and hydrophilic is defined. So, what the important point that I am trying to make over here is, students, molecules that are polar in nature, substances that possess even charges over them, right? There are several mineral ions that are charged, right? Positive charge over them, Na plus, K plus, Mg2 plus. What are these? These are charged molecules, students. So, plasma membrane, the core of the plasma membrane, which is hydrophobic in nature, would not allow movement of such charged ions or polar molecules through them, even there is a concentration gradient existing, right? So, please remember this point, students. Even if there is concentration gradient present across the plasma membrane, such polar molecules, such charged molecules, such hydrophilic substances would not be able to move across the plasma membrane from their higher concentration region to their lower concentration region. They will find it difficult. Why they will find it difficult? Who is providing the resistance? The lipid bilayer, the hydrophobic layer is providing resistance, and because of which the movement of such polar or charged molecules need to be facilitated. And who is facilitating? The plasma membrane proteins. The proteins present in the plasma membrane will facilitate their transport. So, please remember, students, this is all about facilitated diffusion, and now I am pretty sure that you must be knowing that why such substances need to be transported with the help of facilitated transport. Is there anyone who is still finding difficulty in any of the terms that I have mentioned on board? Do let me know in the chat box. Alright, so then now I will love to move towards the characteristics of facilitated diffusion, right? So, let us talk about the very first is the direction. So, when we talk about direction, students, the substances that are moving with the help of facilitated diffusion, they move along the concentration gradient, and that is termed as downhill movement. What is downhill movement? Whenever substances move along the concentration gradient. What is along the concentration gradient? Means moving from their higher concentration region to their lower concentration region. Such a movement is along the gradient, and such a movement is downhill. So, characteristics of facilitated diffusion, when I talk about direction, then substances that are moving with the help of facilitated diffusion is what? The direction is towards concentration gradient. And what is towards concentration gradient? From their higher region concentration, movement will be from their lower concentration, and this is also termed as movement towards concentration gradient is also termed as downhill movement. Downhill movement. Tell me, kids, is there any doubt till now? I always love addressing doubts. So, if there's anyone who wants to ask doubts, please feel free to ask doubts. When you ask doubts, that simply means you are an active listener. So, do show me that you are an active listener. Next question. Next characteristics is energy. See, students, if you notice here, this is an example of facilitated diffusion. And see here, students, who is getting facilitatedly diffused? Who is getting facilitatedly diffused over here is, this is plasma membrane, right? And what are these, my kids? These blue structures are the plasma membrane proteins that are helping in the facilitated diffusion of these green molecules. See, my kids, here. So, if you notice these green molecules, there is a higher concentration of green molecules over here. Where? There is a higher concentration of green molecules, right? There is a higher concentration of green molecules in this extracellular fluid, and there is a lower concentration of these green molecules towards this intracellular fluid, and with the help of membrane proteins, these green molecules, although I have circled it with a red ink, that doesn't mean that they have converted into red one. Please remember this, okay? So these green molecules are moving with the help of these membrane proteins from their region of higher concentration to their region of lower concentration. This is an example of facilitated diffusion, and since the movement is along the concentration gradient from high to low, downhill, hence there is no requirement of utilizing ATP energy for movement of such substances, right? So there is no involvement of ATP. There is no involvement of ATP, right my kids? Please let me know if you are able to relate this. No expenditure of ATP energy because substances are moving along concentration gradient. I hope students you are able to follow this match. Next comes specificity. Yes, facilitated diffusion is quite specific in nature. Why? Because it involves membrane proteins, and please do not forget my lovely kids, membrane proteins are quite specific in what do they carry. That means all types of membrane proteins will not transport all different types of molecules across plasma membrane. So these membrane proteins are quite specific in what they carry. That means a particular membrane protein might allow movement or transport of 1, 2 or 3 types of molecules or substances across it. So whenever membrane proteins are involved in transportation of substances across plasma membrane, that particular transport becomes quite specific in nature because membrane proteins are specific in what they carry. So yes, facilitated diffusion, I am writing FD in short. FD means facilitated diffusion is specific in nature because they involve membrane proteins for transport which are specific in what they carry. Yes my kids, please notice membrane proteins are quite specific. Membrane proteins are quite specific in what they carry, hence making facilitated diffusion a specific one, right? Next questions, next character students. Next characteristic we need to discuss is which one? Saturation. Yes. So my kids, whenever membrane proteins are going to be used in transporting substances across plasma membrane, that particular transport will show saturation effect. What is saturation effect? So see here students, with the help of this simple and effective image you can understand. This is facilitated diffusion. Substances are moving with the help of these blue colored membrane proteins. So membrane proteins cannot load themselves infinitely, right? So once for an instance, for a moment, if all the membrane proteins that are involved in facilitated diffusion present on a plasma membrane of a particular cell, right? If all the membrane proteins are already loaded with the substance that need to be transported, they cannot overload or they cannot take another molecule until and unless they transport the already loaded one. So at the moment when all the membrane proteins are already loaded with the substances, at that time you can say a particular transport, facilitated diffusion, has become saturated. The membrane has become saturated, the membrane proteins have become saturated. Now until and unless they transport this particular molecule that is already present in them, until and unless they transport this one, they cannot take another one, right? So I really hope students, now this word should be clear to all of you, that first of all, what is saturation effect, and second, how saturation effect comes during facilitated diffusion, and who is the one who is going to show this saturation effect. It is the plasma membrane proteins, the carrier proteins that are facilitating the facilitated diffusion of substances. They are going to show the saturation effect, right? So yes, facilitated diffusion, yes, FD, facilitated diffusion, do show saturation effect. Next students, sensitivity. Yes, whenever membrane proteins are used in transport, such a particular transport also show or also become sensitive towards the inhibitors. So what are inhibitors? They are certain chemical substances that can interact with the protein side chains of these membrane proteins, and if this happens, then what will happen? If certain inhibitors react with the protein side chains of these membrane proteins, these carrier proteins, then because of this reaction, the characteristic or the property of these membrane proteins will change. So what they were doing before the reaction with the inhibitor, they won't be able to carry the same function after the reaction with the inhibitor. That means they are going to somehow affect who? The inhibitors are going to somehow affect the transportation of particular substance, right? So please remember students, facilitated diffusion do get affected by inhibitors, by the presence of inhibitors that can react with protein side chains, right? So whenever there will be reaction with the protein side chains of these membrane proteins, right, reaction with inhibitor with the protein side chains, right, as a result the property of these proteins will change and they won't be able to do or perform the function that were doing before the reaction. That means they won't be able to smoothly transport the substances from their higher to their lower concentration. So yes, facilitated diffusion do get affected because of the presence of membrane, because of the presence of inhibitors. Next students, next is, so there is something important that we need to note over here is during facilitated diffusion, there is transport of substances from their higher to their lower concentration, right? Although facilitated diffusion is facilitated or aided by membrane protein, but presence of a concentration gradient is must. So remember students, for facilitated diffusion to take place, for FD, facilitated diffusion to take place, concentration gradient should be present. So concentration gradient should be present or should already be present across plasma membrane. So please note students, the presence of membrane proteins or the help of the membrane proteins that are actually helping in facilitated diffusion will not establish this concentration gradient. Please note this point. The membrane proteins, the carrier proteins that are helping in the facilitated diffusion, they are not going to establish this. They are not going to establish this concentration gradient. It should be present already for facilitated diffusion to take place. I really hope, students, this much is clear to all of you. Next is, kids, let us talk about movement of water. Let us talk about movement of water across plasma membrane. So please note this very important point, students. Majority of the water molecules pass through the plasma membrane with the help of facilitated diffusion. Why? I told you that water is a polar molecule and the plasma membrane core is made up of lipid bilayer, which is actually hydrophobic in nature. Hence, water molecules cannot easily pass through the spaces present between the lipid bilayer. Hence, the movement of water molecules from their higher to their lower concentration need to be facilitated, right? Only a very little or significant amount of water get transported with the help of diffusion, with the help of simple diffusion. So note, majority of the water molecules will cross the plasma membrane with the help of facilitated diffusion, and only a little or a significant amount of water will move with the help of simple diffusion. So the point is, most of the water molecules will cross plasma membrane, this one. So this movement is going to be most, this is least. So water molecule passing with the help of simple diffusion through the plasma membrane, this will be very significant amount, and the water molecules passing with the help of facilitated diffusion across the plasma membrane will be in significant amount. So most of the water molecules will cross plasma membrane with the help of what? With the help of facilitated diffusion. Now see, students, next point that you need to understand is about membrane proteins. So see, students, there are some membrane proteins, or there are proteins that are present in a membrane that form channels for the transport of substances. Some channels are always open and some can be controlled, right? And through these channels, even large variety of molecules can pass. So what I want to make a point over here is membrane proteins, or some proteins present in membrane form channels for substances to move, right? Now talking about these channels, my kids, some channels some are always open, some are always open, and see, students, others can be controlled or regulated. So other channels can be controlled. Now another point that you need to note over here is, students, through these channels large variety of molecules can pass. Now another important point that you need to understand and also given in your NCERT is about porins. What are porins? Porins are actually, my kids, they are proteins. P for porin, P for protein, right? So porins are proteins. Porins are proteins that form large pores in the outer membrane of mitochondria, plastids, and even in some of the bacteria. And through this, molecules up to a size of small protein can easily pass through. So these porins helps the channels, right? These porins helps the channels to allow molecules up to a size of small protein to cross the membrane, right. So, porins are proteins that form large pores, in the outer membrane of plastids, mitochondria and in some bacteria, right. Another point that you should understand is, my kids, porins allow molecules up to a size of small proteins to pass through them, right. Please note this point, very, very important. What are porins? Where they are present? What are they going to do, right? Porins are proteins. They form large pores in the outer membranes of plastid, mitochondria and even in some bacteria, and they allow molecules up to a size of small protein to easily pass through them. Another important fact also given in your NCERT, please note students, water channels, right? We were talking about channels, membrane proteins forming channels. So, water channels are, MO means made up of 8, what? 8. Please notice this point, they are made up of 8 different types of, 8 different types of aquaporins. Please note students, water channels are made up of 8 different types of aquaporins. So, these are the important facts that you need to remember from facilitated diffusion. Now, let us move to the next important point. Yeah. So, see students, please notice this, that there are some carriers or transport proteins that allow movement of substances only when two different molecules move together. Yes. So, let us see students, symport and antiport. Remember, they are passive transport. Now, we are going to talk about passive, symport and antiport. Remember, they are first of all passive. That means no utilization of energy, or ATP energy won't be utilized, or there won't be any expenditure of ATP energy, right, or energy in any other form. So, there won't be any expenditure of energy first of all. Second of all, here we are talking about facilitated diffusion only, right. That means we will talk about membrane proteins or carrier proteins that are going to transport substances along the concentration gradient without utilizing or without doing any expenditure of energy of any form, right. So, passive symport and passive antiport are what? Example of facilitated diffusion, where substances are going to move from their higher to their lower concentration. But then what's the difference? Why are we why the NCERT has given the term symport and antiport? Why simply the facilitated diffusion word was not enough, right? So, try to understand students why this passive symport and antiport is having little variations or little difference when it comes to facilitated diffusion. Although this passive symport and antiport are a type of facilitated diffusion only, but with one special term or condition, that is, see, listen this very carefully. Some carriers or transport proteins, some carriers these are carriers. Some carriers or transport proteins allow movement through them only when two substances, only when two different substances move togetherly. Very important, right? So my kids, what you need to focus over here is on these terms. First is two different substances, and another thing that you need to notice is move togetherly, right? ये दो चीज़ें बहुत important है मेरे प्यारे बच्चों. इसी से ही आप इसको समझ पाओगे कि ये क्यों थोड़ा बहुत different है facilitated diffusion. But remember, facilitated diffusion ही है, but एक special condition क्या है इसके अंदर? इसके अंदर ये special condition है कि symport और antiport में the carriers or transport protein will allow the movement of substances from their higher to their lower concentration only and only when two different types of substances move across them simultaneously or togetherly. तो ध्यान रखना, two different types of substances should move, and that too togetherly. So see here my kids, the first one is symport that I need to discuss. So symport, what is symport? So in symport, what happens is for transporting one particular type of substance across membrane, another type of molecule need to be transported simultaneously along the concentration gradient. Right my kids? Please notice this. I have super simplified this definition of symport over here. Please notice this my kids, please notice this. Symport, this is an example of symport, and please notice here my kids, in order to transport this A type, in order to transport this A type of substance, there has to be transport of this B type of substance also along the same direction. So at the same time, these two types of substances A and B are crossing this particular carrier protein, right? So what happens in symport, some carrier proteins or transport proteins allow transport only and only across them, only and only when two different types of substances move togetherly. So in symport, these two different types of substances move in the same direction, and hence the name symport. Now let us see how antiport is different. In antiport, students, in order to allow or in order to move this A type of substance from this region to this region along the concentration gradient, another substance B should come out or should move in the opposite direction. So direction of movement is opposite direction. So see my kids, in order to allow So this particular carrier protein will allow the movement of A type of substance along the concentration gradient from this region to this region only and only when a B type of a substance is going to move from this region to this region again along the concentration gradient. That means concentration of A over here is more and concentration of A over here is low. Concentration of B over here is high and concentration of B over here is low, and that is why these two substances are moving along the same carrier protein in the two different directions but along their concentration gradient. And this is an example of what, my kids? This is an example of antiport, right? So this is an example of antiport. So what is an antiport? Movement of two different substances through a carrier protein in different, or rather I should say in opposite direction, in opposite direction along concentration gradient, along their concentration gradient. I hope this much is clear to all of you students that what is an antiport. Now let us see another very important thing, that is uniport. What is uniport? Uniport is a bit different from symport and antiport. How? In symport and antiport, in order to transport a single type of substance, another type of substance should also move either in the same or in opposite direction. But when it comes to uniport students, a particular type of a substance can easily move through the carrier protein without depending on any other substance movement, right? So in uniport, this is an example of uniport students where this A type of substances can easily get transported with the help of this carrier protein without getting affected by any other type substances movement, right? So in uniport, what will happen? Substances can move through a carrier protein independently. There is no dependence on any other substance movement. So substances can move through a carrier protein independently along their concentration gradient, right students? I hope uniport, symport, antiport all are crystal clear to all of you, right? I hope this much is clear to all of you. Now let us see the next thing. Next thing is active transport, my kids. The next thing is active transport, and this is an amazing image with the help of which I can explain you what active transport is. Remember, in active transport, the movement of substances will be against the concentration gradient. That means substances are going to move from their lower concentration to their higher concentration, and here there will be involvement or utilization or expenditure of energy in form of ATP, and there will be utilization of special membrane proteins known as pumps that can transport the substances actively against the concentration gradient. So let us see in detail what active transport is. So by the definition, I can say here substances move using active transport. Substances move from their lower concentration region to their higher concentration region, right? Concentration region using special proteins, special membrane proteins known as pumps, right? So see here students, if you notice this particular red substance, this particular diamond shaped red substance, it is actually the concentration of this red substance 1, 2, 3 and here several. So concentration of this is actually low here and concentration of this red colored diamond is actually high over here, and the substances with the help of these special proteins, what are these? These are pumps. These are pumps. Pumps are the special membrane proteins. So with the help of these special membrane proteins, the substances, the red color diamond substances are getting transported from their lower concentration region to their higher concentration region with the help of ATP energy. Now see the students, or just opposite. See here, green substances, these green balls are present in low concentration in this region, intracellular fluid. And when it comes to this extracellular fluid, these green color balls are in actually higher concentration. With the help of this special membrane proteins, the pumps, they are using the ATP energy to transport these green balls from their region of their lower concentration to the region of their higher concentration. So substances move from their lower concentration to their higher concentration region using the special proteins known as pumps. So that is active transport. Now let us take in brief what are the characteristics of active transport. So let us start with the first one, my kids. The first one is direction. So obviously the substances that move with the help of active transport actually move against the concentration movement, against the concentration gradient. So movement of substances, movement is against the concentration gradient, and such a movement which is against the concentration gradient, that is from lower region of concentration to higher region of concentration, is termed as uphill. What it is termed as, my lovely kids? It is termed as uphill. It is uphill. So in means of transport, very simple students, only active transport is uphill. Facilitated transport and simple facilitated diffusion and simple diffusion were actually downhill, but the active transport is uphill because it is against the concentration gradient from lower to higher concentration region. Now let us talk about energy. Yes, energy is definitely utilized. So AT means active transport. AT show expenditure of ATP energy, right? So energy is definitely getting utilized in form of ATP, right? Because energy is required to move the substances against the concentration gradient, because I can say that there is no spontaneous movement, right students, because moving from lower concentration to higher concentration is not a spontaneous movement. For such a non-spontaneous movement to take place, definitely energy need to be provided. Next is specificity. Yes, AT or active transport is specific. Why it is specific? Because it involves membrane protein. Yes, so yes, AT yani active transport is specific because it involves membrane proteins. It involves special membrane proteins known as pumps, right my kids? Next point is, see here, from lower concentration to higher concentration with the help of a proton pump, H plus ions will be transported and there will be expenditure of ATP energy. Next is yes, AT or active transport will show saturation effect. AT will show saturation effect, because it involves membrane proteins. And remember students, membrane proteins do get saturated once they are loaded with the that molecules that need to be transported. Yes, yes, AT is sensitive, active transport is sensitive towards the inhibitor molecules that can interact with the protein side chains, right? Now next students, I hope all these points and all these characteristics of active transport are crystal clear to all of you. Now what are we going to do is, we are going to do a quick comparison between all the three means of transport: simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion and active transport. This table is actually going to help you in getting answers correct in your MCQ questions, students, right? So this is a quick summary. So with the help of these special important points, we are going to these special important properties, we are going to do the comparison, very quick comparison and very easy and very important. So let us talk about requirement of special membrane proteins, right? Who requires special membrane proteins to transport substances across plasma membrane? So definitely it is not diffusion, simple diffusion. Simple diffusion do not require involvement of membrane protein to transport substances across plasma membrane. Facilitated diffusion do require, they also require, they in fact require pumps that can do active transport, right? These membrane proteins that helps in facilitated transport do not show active transport, they do not utilize ATP energy. The proteins, the membrane proteins that are doing facilitated diffusion cannot transport substances against the concentration gradient. The membrane proteins involved in facilitated transport actually transport substances along the concentration gradient, not against, but pumps do that. Highly selective, yes students, simple diffusion is not highly selective. Who is highly selective? The one that uses, who is highly selective? The one that uses membrane proteins, right my kids? Only that type of transport can be highly selective that uses membrane proteins. Simple diffusion does not use membrane proteins, then how come it can become selective? Only facilitated diffusion and active transport are highly selective in nature. Transport saturate, again students, who can saturate? Only the one that uses membrane proteins. So my kids, very simple logic. Which of the following transport can show saturation? Only the one that is going to use or involve membrane proteins, right? So simple diffusion does not use membrane proteins, hence it cannot show saturation. Saturation can be seen in facilitated transport and active transport because they do involve membrane proteins for transporting substances across plasma membrane. Uphill transport. What is uphill transport, students? Against concentration gradient, that is movement from lower to higher concentration. Such a type of uphill transport is seen in active transport. Here in fact in both it is downhill and here also it is downhill. That means along the concentration gradient substances move in simple and facilitated diffusion. Requirement of ATP energy. In simple diffusion there is no requirement of ATP energy. In facilitated diffusion there is no requirement of ATP energy, but in active transport there is requirement of ATP energy. Why? Because there is an uphill transport. So ATP is required in uphill transport. ATP is required in uphill transport. And who is doing uphill transport? Only active one. These two, simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion, show downhill movement from their higher to their lower concentration region. Hence ATP energy is not required, right? Expenditure of energy is not required to assist or aid the movement of such substances, right students? So okay, that's all from this class. I really hope that in this session the entire means of transport topic is crystal clear to all of you, but still if there is any doubt, do let me know right now or maybe in the next session. Thank you very much for joining this session and thank you very much for also showing the engagement. Do give me a thumbs up if you like me and this session, and do not forget to subscribe Infinity Learn by Sri Chaitanya. Also hit the bell icon so that whenever in the future I'm going to go live, you will be notified every time and won't miss any single session in future. That's all students. Bye-bye. We'll meet again.